Hello, welcome to Lily's Stories, where I share my passion for storytelling. Hope you enjoy the journey. The crystal chandelier cast a soft glow over the Rothschild mansion's opulent dining room, its light reflecting off the polished silver and fine china. The air was thick with tension as the engagement dinner for James Rothschild and Amara Johnson unfolded. Alexander Rothschild, patriarch of the family, sat at the head of the table, his steely gaze fixed on the couple. His wife, Elizabeth, sat quietly beside him, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and son. James had felt uneasy from the moment they had arrived. His father's cold reception of Amara, a brilliant architect with deep brown skin and keen intelligence, had set the tone for the evening. The clinking of silverware against fine china punctuated the strained silence, occasionally broken by forced small talk from James's sisters, who seemed torn between family loyalty and genuine affection for Amara. As the main course was served, Alexander cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. His face was a mask of barely contained disdain as he addressed the table. The words that followed were sharp and cutting, laced with thinly veiled racism and disappointment. He spoke of family legacy, of expectations, and of the perceived stain on the Rothschild name. His voice grew louder as he recounted generations of carefully cultivated connections and alliances, implying that James's choice threatened to unravel it all. Amara's back stiffened, her eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and defiance. She had anticipated resistance, but not this level of open hostility. James's hand found hers under the table, squeezing it in silent support. The young man's jaw clenched as he listened to his father's tirade, anger building within him like a pressure cooker. He glanced at his mother, hoping for intervention, but Elizabeth remained silent, her eyes downcast. When James finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He defended Amara, their love, and their choices. He highlighted Amara's accomplishments, her character, and the strength she would bring to the family. The exchange quickly escalated, voices rising and faces flushing with emotion. James's sisters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while the household staff hovered at the edges of the room, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. The breaking point came swiftly and brutally. Alexander, his face contorted with rage, slammed his fist on the table. The impact sent wine glasses toppling, their contents spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like blood. In that moment, he disowned James, cutting him off from the family fortune and name. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Elizabeth's soft gasp and the sound of chairs scraping against the hardwood floor. James and Amara rose, dignity intact despite the humiliation they had endured. They made their way out of the dining room, heads held high. James paused briefly at the door, looking back at his family. His sisters avoided his gaze, while his mother's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Alexander stood rigid, his back to the departing couple. As they reached the grand foyer, the echo of their footsteps on marble seemed to underscore the finality of the moment. The family portraits lining the walls stared down at them. Generations of Rothschilds bearing silent witness to the fracture in their lineage. The massive oak doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, sealing off the world of wealth and prejudice they were leaving behind. In the cool night air, James and Amara paused on the mansion's steps. The manicured gardens stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the emotional devastation they had just experienced. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. They had each other, and that was enough. With intertwined hands and steely resolve, they descended the steps, ready to forge their own path, free from the shadows of the Rothschild legacy. As they walked down the long driveway, the weight of what had transpired began to settle on James's shoulders. He had known his father was set in his ways, but the depth of Alexander's prejudice had shocked him. The reasons behind this deep-seated bias remained a mystery, one that would haunt James in the days to come. Questions about his family's past and the true nature of their wealth and influence swirled in his mind. Amara squeezed James's hand, bringing him back to the present. Her strength and resilience in the face of such blatant discrimination only reinforced his love and admiration for her. As they reached the iron gates of the estate, they paused once more, looking back at the illuminated mansion that had once been James's home. The couple shared a determined look before stepping out onto the street, leaving behind the world of privilege and entering an uncertain but self-determined future. The night enveloped them as they walked away, their silhouettes gradually fading into the darkness. The Rothschild mansion loomed behind them, its windows glowing with a light that no longer welcomed them. The discord of the dinner had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not only James and Amara but the very foundations of the Rothschild empire. 6 months had passed since the disastrous engagement dinner. Alexander Rothschild sat in his opulent home office, the early morning light filtering through heavy curtains. The room, once a sanctuary of power and control, now felt suffocating. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as he opened his email. The notification sound pierced the silence. A new message appeared, sender unknown. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he read the subject line, "Your past demands a reckoning." With growing dread, he opened the email. The message was brief, but its impact was seismic. Attached were photographs and documents that Alexander had believed were long buried. His eyes widened in shock as he scrolled through the evidence of a corruption scheme from 3 decades ago. Memories he had suppressed came flooding back, vivid and damning. Alexander's mind raced back to that time. He had been a young, ambitious real estate developer, hungry for success at any cost. The scheme had involved bribing city officials, manipulating zoning laws, and displacing low-income families. It had been the cornerstone of his empire, the foundation upon which he had built his fortune. As he stared at the screen, Alexander's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The blackmailer's demands were clear, a substantial sum of money in exchange for silence. The alternative was full exposure, which would mean not only financial ruin but also potential criminal charges. For hours, Alexander paced his office, his mind a whirlwind of panic and desperate strategizing. He had made many powerful enemies over the years, any of whom could be behind this threat. The not knowing gnawed at him, adding another layer to his growing paranoia. He considered his options. Paying the blackmailer seemed the easiest solution, but Alexander knew it would only be a temporary fix. Once paid, there was no guarantee the threats would stop. Going to the authorities was out of the question. It would mean admitting to his crimes and facing the consequences he had evaded for so long. As the day wore on, Alexander's desperation grew. He made frantic calls to old associates, seeking advice or support, but found only vague promises and thinly veiled threats. The walls of his office seemed to close in on him, the portraits of his ancestors staring down with judging eyes. It was in this moment of despair that Alexander's thoughts turned to James. His son, whom he had cast out in a moment of bigoted rage, was now a successful lawyer specializing in white-collar crime. The irony was not lost on Alexander. He had always prided himself on solving his own problems, on being the master of his destiny, but now, facing the greatest threat of his life, he realized he needed help, James's help. The realization brought a mix of emotions. Pride warred with necessity, and lingering resentment clashed with a desperate hope. Alexander knew that reaching out to James would mean confronting not only this current crisis but also the painful rift he had created in their family. As night fell, Alexander sat at his desk, staring at James's contact information on his phone. His finger hovered over the call button, the weight of his decisions, past and present, pressing down on him. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, a reminder that time was running out. In the shadows of his office, surrounded by the trappings of his ill-gotten success, Alexander Rothschild faced a stark choice. He could cling to his pride and potentially lose everything, or he could swallow his prejudice and reach out to the son he had wronged. The blackmailer's threat loomed over him, a Damocles sword ready to fall at any moment. With a deep breath, Alexander picked up the phone. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the potential for further loss. But as he dialed James's number, one thing was clear: the shadowy sins of the past had finally caught up with Alexander Rothschild, and the reckoning was at hand. The incessant ringing of James's phone had become a source of irritation over the past week. Each time Alexander's name flashed on the screen, James had felt a mixture of anger and curiosity. Yet, he had chosen to ignore the calls, unwilling to reopen old wounds. In their modest but comfortable apartment, James and Amara had been engrossed in wedding plans. The joy that radiated from them was palpable, a stark contrast to the tension that had permeated the Rothschild mansion. They had chosen a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends who had supported their relationship from the start. As they pored over seating arrangements and floral designs, the world of high society and family expectations seemed a distant memory. Amara had noticed James's unease with each ignored call from his father. She had gently probed, but James had brushed off her concerns, determined not to let Alexander's sudden attempts at communication cast a shadow over their happiness. Yet, the frequency of the calls had planted a seed of worry in both their minds. At his law office, James had thrown himself into his work, building a reputation as a skilled and ethical lawyer. His colleagues had come to respect him for his dedication and integrity, traits he had cultivated in direct opposition to the values he had grown up with. The sleek, modern office space was a world away from the opulent Rothschild businesses, and James took pride in every case he won on his own merit. It was on a busy Thursday afternoon when the impossible happened. James had just wrapped up a meeting with a client when his assistant knocked on the door, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. She informed him that his father was in the reception area, insisting on seeing him. The news hit James like a physical blow. He had imagined many scenarios of reconciliation or confrontation with his father, but never this Alexander coming to him, to his territory. For a moment, James considered having security escort his father out. But curiosity and a lingering sense of familial duty stayed his hand. As Alexander was shown into the office, the contrast between father and son was stark. Alexander, once the epitome of confidence and power, now appeared haggard and desperate. His usually impeccable suit was slightly rumpled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. James, on the other hand, exuded a calm confidence, his posture straight and unyielding behind his desk. The tension in the room was palpable as Alexander began to speak. His voice, once commanding, now held a note of pleading that James had never heard before. Alexander spoke of mistakes, of regret, and of a dire need for James's expertise. He alluded to a threat that could destroy not just him, but potentially the entire family. James listened in stony silence, his face a mask of professional detachment. Inside, however, his emotions roiled. The part of him that still yearned for his father's approval warred with the anger and hurt that had built up over the years. Moreover, his lawyer's instincts were on high alert, sensing that there was much more to this story than Alexander was revealing. As Alexander's plea came to an end, the office fell into a heavy silence. The distant sounds of the city below seemed to emphasize the gulf between them. James was faced with a decision that could alter the course of both their lives. To help would mean reopening old wounds and potentially compromising the principles he had built his new life upon. To refuse would be to turn his back on family, something he had accused his father of doing just months ago. The irony of the situation was not lost on James. He had spent years trying to escape his father's shadow, to build a life and career based on merit rather than name. Now, that very expertise was what brought Alexander to his door, humbled and desperate. As James contemplated his response, he realized that whatever decision he made would come at a cost. The happy bubble he and Amara had been living in for the past 6 months was about to burst, one way or another. The question that remained was whether the price of helping his father would be worth the potential consequences. The clock on James's desk ticked loudly, marking the moments of this pivotal encounter. Father and son regarded each other, years of unspoken words and suppressed emotions hanging between them. The next words out of James's mouth would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could fully anticipate, with repercussions that would extend far beyond the confines of this office. The tension in James's office had been palpable as he delivered his response to Alexander's plea. With a mixture of regret and resolve, James had declined to help his father, citing the ethical implications and the personal toll it would take. Alexander had left, defeated and visibly shaken, leaving James with a tumult of conflicting emotions. In the days that followed, James had found himself unable to shake the encounter from his mind. The image of his father, once so proud and imposing, reduced to a desperate shell of his former self, haunted James's thoughts. Despite his initial refusal, curiosity began to gnaw at him, fueled by the cryptic hints Alexander had dropped about a threat to the entire family. Amara had noticed the change in James's demeanor. One evening, as they sat in their living room, the warm glow of table lamps casting long shadows, she gently probed him about the meeting with his father. James's reluctance to discuss the matter fully only heightened her concern. With her characteristic insight, Amara suggested that perhaps investigating the situation, even from a distance, might provide James with some closure or at least answers to long-standing questions about his family. Her words had struck a chord. James realized that his refusal to help was not just about maintaining ethical boundaries, but also about fear of what he might uncover about his family and himself. Amara's encouragement, coupled with her unwavering support, gave James the push he needed to start digging. Under the guise of organizing old files in his home office, James began to sift through documents and photographs he had taken when he left the Rothschild mansion. Most were innocuous old report cards, family vacation photos, business articles praising Alexander's acumen. But as he delved deeper, James stumbled upon a locked box he had forgotten about, a relic from his mother's belongings that he had impulsively grabbed during his hasty departure. With trembling hands, James had picked the lock. Inside, he found a collection of papers, photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. As he began to read, his world tilted on its axis. The journal entries, penned in his mother's elegant handwriting, spoke of secrets and schemes that James had never imagined. References to meetings, coded messages, and large sums of money painted a picture of a woman far removed from the gentle, supportive mother he remembered. One photograph in particular caught his eye. It showed his mother in deep conversation with a man James didn't recognize, but whose face bore a striking resemblance to a prominent city official who had been embroiled in a corruption scandal years ago. The date on the back of the photo coincided with the time frame Alexander had mentioned during his desperate plea. As the night wore on, James pieced together a disturbing narrative. His mother, whom he had always seen as a passive figure in the family's affairs, appeared to have played a pivotal role in the very scheme that now threatened to unravel the Rothschild empire. The realization sent shockwaves through James, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his family and his own identity. The sound of Amara's soft footsteps in the hallway jolted James back to the present. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one from Lily's Stories. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you in the next one. He quickly gathered the documents, his mind racing with questions and implications. As Amara entered the room, concern etched on her face, James knew he had to share his discoveries with her. Her perspective had always been his anchor, and now, more than ever, he needed her clarity and strength. James's world had been upended once again. The moral high ground he had claimed in refusing to help his father now seemed shaky at best. The secrets of the past, long buried and forgotten, had resurfaced with a vengeance, threatening not just the Rothschild legacy but James's very understanding of his family and himself. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the windows, James and Amara sat surrounded by the scattered remnants of a hidden past. The path forward was unclear, fraught with ethical dilemmas and potential dangers. But one thing was certain: the secrets James had uncovered would change everything, and the decision he now faced would have far-reaching consequences for all involved. The early morning sun cast long shadows across James's office as he awaited his father's arrival. The decision to help Alexander had not come easily, and the weight of it hung heavily in the air. James had spent the night drafting a list of conditions, each one a safeguard against the ethical minefield he was about to enter. When Alexander entered, the change in his demeanor was palpable. Hope had replaced desperation in his eyes, though the strain of recent events still etched deep lines on his face. James's voice was steady as he laid out his terms: full transparency, no illegal actions, and the right to walk away if things went too far. Alexander had nodded, relief evident in the slump of his shoulders. The investigation began with a meticulous review of the blackmail evidence. James's legal training came to the fore as he dissected each document, looking for clues and inconsistencies. Alexander watched, a mix of pride and unease flickering across his face as his son dismantled the very schemes he had once orchestrated. As they worked, the tension between them ebbed and flowed. Moments of productive collaboration were interspersed with terse exchanges, years of unresolved conflict bubbling just beneath the surface. The clacking of keyboard keys and the rustle of papers filled the silences, a constant reminder of the task at hand. Their first breakthrough came late in the afternoon. A name in one of the old contracts caught James's attention: Victor Holloway, a former business associate of Alexander's who had disappeared from the public eye years ago. Alexander's reaction to the name was visceral. A sharp intake of breath that didn't go unnoticed by James. With renewed focus, they dug deeper into Holloway's involvement. Old news articles and business records painted a picture of a man who had once been as ambitious and ruthless as Alexander himself. Financial records showed a sudden influx of wealth to Holloway's accounts around the time of the questionable land deals, followed by an equally abrupt withdrawal and disappearance. As night fell, the office grew dim, the glow of computer screens casting an eerie light on the faces of father and son. They had constructed a timeline on a large whiteboard, connecting events, deals, and key players with red string. At the center of it all was Holloway, a ghost from the past who now seemed to hold the key to their current predicament. James couldn't help but notice the parallels between Holloway and his father. Both men had risen to power through questionable means, but while Alexander had continued to build his empire, Holloway had vanished. The question that now hung in the air was why Holloway had resurfaced after all these years, and what he hoped to gain by threatening Alexander. As they prepared to call it a night, the atmosphere in the office was charged with a mix of anticipation and dread. They had made progress, but each revelation seemed to uncover more questions than answers. James felt the weight of his mother's journal in his briefcase, a secret he had yet to share with his father. The knowledge it contained could shatter their fragile alliance, but it might also be the key to understanding the full scope of the threat they faced. Alexander lingered at the door, his hand resting on the handle. For a moment, it seemed he might say something, perhaps an apology or a word of gratitude. But the moment passed, and with a curt nod, he left, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Left alone, James stared at the web of connections they had mapped out. The ghost of Victor Holloway seemed to loom over everything, a specter from the past threatening to destroy the present. As he gathered his things to leave, James couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of a much deeper, darker secret. The investigation had begun, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. James knew that each step forward would test not only his legal skills but also his moral compass. As he locked up the office, the weight of his decision to help his father pressed down on him. The line between right and wrong, once so clear in his mind, had begun to blur, and James couldn't help but wonder if, in his quest for the truth, he might lose sight of the principles he had fought so hard to uphold. The musty smell of old paper filled the air as James and Alexander sifted through a newly discovered cache of documents. They had spent days following the trail left by Victor Holloway, which had led them to an abandoned storage unit on the outskirts of the city. The unit, rented under a false name, had yielded a treasure trove of information that threatened to unravel everything James thought he knew about his family. As James carefully unfolded a yellow document, his breath caught in his throat. Before him lay irrefutable evidence of the corruption scheme his father had alluded to, but it was far more extensive than he had imagined. The document detailed a complex web of bribes, shell companies, and manipulated land deals that had formed the foundation of the Rothschild fortune. Alexander's face paled as he recognized the document. His hands shook slightly as he reached for it, but James pulled it away, his jaw set in a hard line. The tension in the small Dusty room was palpable, the only sound the rustle of paper and the heavy breathing of both men. James's mind raced as he connected the dots. The scheme had not been just a one-time occurrence but a systematic exploitation that had spanned decades. As he continued to read, a familiar name caught his eye, his mother's. Her signature graced several of the documents, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in the fraudulent activities. The shock of this revelation hit James like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes. The crash echoed in the confined space, punctuating the moment of terrible realization. Alexander moved to steady his son. But James recoiled from his touch, anger and betrayal etched across his face. In that moment, James confronted his father, his voice, usually controlled and measured, cracked with emotion as he demanded the truth. The full truth, not just about the scheme, but about his mother's involvement. Alexander's shoulders sagged under the weight of decades of secrets finally coming to light. As Alexander spoke, the full extent of the family's deception unfolded. James's mother had not been the innocent bystander he had always believed her to be. She had been a key player in the Rothschild empire's darker dealings, her keen mind for numbers and strategy instrumental in concealing their illicit activities. The revelation shattered James's idealized image of his mother. Memories of her gentle smile and comforting presence now took on a sinister edge. Had every moment of his childhood been built on a foundation of lies? The room seemed to spin as James grappled with this new reality. Alexander's voice grew hoarse as he explained the circumstances that had led them down this path. He spoke of ambition, of the intoxicating allure of power, and of the rationalization that had allowed them to justify their actions. But as he looked at his son's face, contorted with a mix of anger and grief, the hollowness of those justifications became painfully clear. James listened in stunned silence, his world crumbling around him. The principles he had built his life upon, his very identity, all seemed to be built on quicksand. The documents scattered around them told a story of greed and corruption that implicated not just his father, but the mother he had idolized. As the full impact of these revelations sank in, James felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger at the deception, grief for the loss of his illusions, and a deep, unsettling uncertainty about his own moral compass. He had agreed to help his father out of a sense of familial duty. But now he questioned whether that decision had already compromised his integrity. The silence that fell between father and son was heavy with unspoken words and shattered trust. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. The fading light seemed to mirror the dimming of James's certainties about his past and his future. As they began to gather the damning documents, the weight of their discoveries hung over them. James knew that what they had uncovered would change everything, not just for his family, but potentially for the entire city. The question that now loomed was what to do with this knowledge. The path of truth and justice seemed clear, but it was fraught with personal and professional peril. The storage unit, once a hidden repository of secrets, now stood as a turning point in both their lives. As they locked the door behind them, James and Alexander stepped into a world forever changed by the revelations of that day. The journey that had begun with a blackmail threat had led them to a truth far more devastating than either could have imagined, and the repercussions of their discoveries were only beginning to unfold. The abandoned warehouse loomed before James and Alexander, its dilapidated structure a stark contrast to the sleek cityscape behind them. Weeks of intense investigation had led them to this moment, to a confrontation with the mysterious blackmailer who had threatened to unravel the Rothschild empire. As they approached the building, the crunch of gravel under their feet seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. James's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through his veins. Alexander's face was a mask of determination, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his nervousness. They entered the warehouse cautiously, the rusty door creaking ominously. The interior was dimly lit, shadows dancing across piles of discarded machinery and forgotten inventory. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. As they ventured deeper into the cavernous space, a figure emerged from the shadows. Victor Holloway stood before them, a ghost from the past made flesh. His once handsome face was now weathered, etched with lines of bitterness and resentment. His eyes, however, burned with a fierce intensity as they fixed on Alexander. The tension in the room was palpable as Holloway began to speak. His voice, rough from years of silence, filled the warehouse with accusations and long-buried truths. He spoke of betrayal, of deals gone wrong, and of a vendetta nurtured over decades. Each word was a dagger, aimed not just at Alexander but at the very foundation of the Rothschild legacy. As Holloway's tirade continued, James found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew. The blackmail scheme, it turned out, was not just about money or revenge. It was about exposing a truth that had been hidden for far too long, a truth that implicated not just his father, but a whole network of powerful individuals who had built their fortunes on corruption and exploitation. The confrontation took a dangerous turn when Holloway, consumed by years of pent-up rage, lunged at Alexander. The sound of their struggle echoed through the warehouse, a cacophony of grunts, crashes, and the shattering of glass. James, torn between his instinct to protect his father and his commitment to the truth, found himself frozen in indecision. In the midst of the chaos, a startling revelation came to light. Holloway produced evidence that linked James's mother not just to the old corruption schemes, but to a plan to expose everything. She had been gathering evidence, preparing to come clean, when she had died under mysterious circumstances. The implication hung in the air. Unspoken but unmistakable, the world seemed to tilt on its axis for James. The mother he had idolized, then vilified, now emerged as a complex figure caught in a web of lies and seeking redemption. Alexander's face, already battered from the physical confrontation, crumpled with a pain that went beyond the physical. As the dust settled, James found himself at a crossroads. Before him stood his father, a man he had once revered and then despised, now revealed as deeply flawed but not beyond redemption. On the other side was Holloway, a man driven to extremes by injustice, holding the key to exposing decades of corruption. The choice before James was monumental. He could side with his father, help bury the truth once more, and preserve what was left of the Rothschild legacy, or he could embrace the truth his mother had died trying to reveal, risking everything: his family, his career, his very identity. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the three men. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Time was running out, and James knew that his next action would set in motion events that could not be undone. In that moment, James felt the weight of his family's history. The burden of secrets long kept, and the responsibility of the truth, his legal training, his moral compass, and his complex emotions all warred within him as he stood on the precipice of a decision that would change everything. The final confrontation had revealed more than just the identity of a blackmailer. It had laid bare the tangled web of lies, betrayals, and hidden truths that had shaped James's life. As he looked from his father to Holloway and back again, James knew that whatever choice he made would come at a great cost. The path of truth and justice was clear, but it was fraught with personal and professional peril. With the sirens growing louder and the tension in the warehouse reaching a breaking point, James steeled himself to make a decision that would alter the course of not just his life, but potentially the entire city's future. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation had left an indelible mark on all involved. As the dust settled and the legal proceedings began, James found himself navigating a complex web of emotions and responsibilities. The decision he had made in that crucial moment, to expose the truth while negotiating leniency for his father in exchange for cooperation, had set in motion a series of events that would reshape the city's power structures and his own life. Weeks turned into months as the investigation unfolded. James had become a key witness, his testimony instrumental in bringing to light decades of corruption. The Rothschild empire, once seemingly invincible, crumbled under the weight of its own misdeeds. Alexander, stripped of his wealth and influence, faced the consequences of his actions with a resignation that spoke of a man finally confronting the true cost of his ambitions. On a crisp autumn morning, James stood outside the courthouse, the weight of his final testimony still heavy on his shoulders. The air was thick with tension as he awaited his father's emergence. When Alexander appeared, he was a shadow of his former self, his designer suits replaced by simple, nondescript clothing, his once commanding presence diminished. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the full weight of their shared history hung between them. Without a word, they moved to a nearby park, away from the prying eyes of the media that had been hounding them for months. The sound of fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet filled the silence as they walked. When they finally spoke, their voices were low and strained. Alexander's words were heavy with regret, not just for his actions, but for the legacy of deception he had passed on to his son. James listened, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, and a glimmer of something that might have been hope. As they talked, the full extent of their family's transformation became clear. The Rothschild name, once synonymous with power and prestige, now carried the taint of scandal. Yet, in the ashes of their former life, there was a chance for something new to emerge, a relationship built on honesty and shared understanding of their flaws. James spoke of his mother, of the revelation that she had been trying to make things right. The pain in Alexander's eyes as he listened was palpable, a mixture of grief for his late wife and shame for the role he had played in her silent struggle. For the first time, father and son found common ground in their complex feelings for the woman they had both loved and misunderstood. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, James and Alexander reached a tentative understanding. There would be no quick fix. No easy path to forgiveness. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but there was a commitment to try, to rebuild not just their relationship, but their very identities in the wake of all that had been lost. The city around them was changing too. The exposure of the corruption had led to a wave of reforms, a painful but necessary cleansing of long-festering wounds. James found himself at the forefront of these changes, his legal expertise and first-hand experience of the scandal making him a valuable asset in the fight for transparency and accountability. As they parted ways that evening, there was a sense of a chapter closing and another beginning. Alexander headed towards the halfway house that would be his home for the foreseeable future, while James turned towards the apartment he shared with Amara, the woman who had stood by him through this ordeal, offering unwavering support even as she challenged him to stay true to his principles. The night air was cool on James's face as he walked home, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts about the future. The Rothschild legacy had been irrevocably altered, but perhaps, he mused, it could be rebuilt into something worthy of pride, not based on wealth or power, but on integrity and the courage to face hard truths. As he reached his apartment building, James paused to look back at the city skyline. The lights of the buildings twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world he had once been part of and the new one he was helping to shape. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, James felt a sense of hope. Not the blind optimism of his youth, but a tempered, realistic hope born from the crucible of hard-won truths and difficult choices. The sound of Amara's warm welcome as he entered their home grounded him. A reminder of the personal happiness he had found amidst the professional and familial turmoil. As they embraced, James knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with a clearer conscience and a deeper understanding of the complexities of redemption and the true meaning of family. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one from Lily's Stories. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you in the next one.